June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. 373 Japanese aircraft rise from their carriers and begin flying east toward the American fleet. Their pilots are disciplined, experienced, and supremely confident. They have been told that today they will deal America a blow from which it cannot recover. They have flown missions like this before. Over Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines, over the burning oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. They know how this ends, but something is different today. By nightfall, only a fraction of those 373 men will return to their ships. The rest will have met the Hellcat. To understand what happened that June morning, you have to go back to a time when Japan's Air Force seemed unstoppable and American aviation seemed hopelessly outmatched. December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor announced to the world that Japan possessed something extraordinary: the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. It was unlike anything the Allies had faced. Light, blindingly fast, and capable of turning inside virtually any fighter it encountered, the Zero had already proven itself over China. Now it announced itself to the rest of the world in smoke and fire. In the months that followed, the Zero continued its rampage. It swept American P-40s from the skies over the Philippines. It helped sink the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse. It terrified Allied pilots who quickly learned that trying to dogfight a Zero was a fatal mistake. But the Zero's supremacy came at a hidden cost. To achieve its astonishing performance, the engineers at Mitsubishi had made a series of deliberate sacrifices. The Zero carried no armor plating to protect its pilot. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A single incendiary round in the right place could turn the aircraft into a fireball. Its airframe was designed to perform beautifully within normal combat conditions, but it could not handle the strain of high-speed dives. Japan had built a sword, magnificent, deadly, and brittle. Meanwhile, in Bethpage, New York, a group of American engineers was about to build something very different. The Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation was not a glamorous company. Their planes were not elegant. They were heavy, angular, and built with what pilots called a naval architect's philosophy: overbuilt, over-armored, and over-engineered for punishment. Pilots who flew Grumman aircraft trusted them with their lives, because those aircraft were designed to absorb everything the enemy could throw at them and keep flying. When the Navy put out the requirement for a new carrier-based fighter in 1941, Grumman had a head start that no one else did. After the disaster at Pearl Harbor and the early defeats across the Pacific, American intelligence made extraordinary efforts to understand the Zero. They recovered wreckage, interviewed pilots, and analyzed its strengths and weaknesses as carefully as they could. Then, in the summer of 1942, they got something priceless. An intact Zero, nearly undamaged, was found on a small Alaskan island called Akutan. The Akutan Zero was shipped to California, repaired and test-flown by American pilots. For the first time, they could feel exactly what the Zero could and could not do: where it was fast, where it was fragile, how it turned, how it dove, how it died. Grumman took that knowledge and built it into their new fighter from the ground up. They called it the F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was not beautiful. By any measure, it was blunt, wide, and almost aggressive in its plainness. Its nose was dominated by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, one of the most powerful aircraft engines in the world at that time, producing 2,000 horsepower. Where the Zero weighed barely 3,700 pounds empty, the Hellcat tipped the scales at nearly 9,000 pounds fully loaded. Japanese pilots, hearing these specifications, were not impressed. Some laughed. They had seen what the Zero could do to heavier, slower American aircraft. Speed and maneuverability had carried the day for 2 years. Why would this change anything? The answer lay in what Grumman had understood and what Japan had not yet fully grasped. The nature of the Pacific Air War was changing. The Hellcat did not need to outturn the Zero. That was the crucial insight. It was faster in a straight line. It was vastly faster in a dive because the Zero's airframe began to shake and lose control at high speed. It could climb away from a Zero in certain situations, and its 650 caliber machine guns were devastating. Each weapon fired belts of ammunition that included armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. A half-second burst from a Hellcat's guns could ignite an unprotected Zero instantly. Where the Zero was a rapier, the Hellcat was a sledgehammer, and American pilots learned to use it accordingly. The doctrine was built on one simple principle: do not fight on Japan's terms, fight on yours. In 1942, Japan's naval aviators were the finest in the world. The men who flew at Pearl Harbor were the products of an extraordinarily rigorous selection and training program. Many had hundreds of hours of combat experience. Some were true aces who had made their reputations over China before the Pacific War even began. But Japan's training pipeline was brutally inefficient. Producing a skilled Zero pilot took years, and Japan was running out of years. Every carrier battle ground away at that irreplaceable pool of expertise. Coral Sea, Midway, Santa Cruz, the grinding Solomons campaign. The pilots who died could not simply be replaced. Their replacements arrived with fewer hours, less experience, and growing anxiety about what they were being sent to face. Meanwhile, America was doing the opposite. The United States threw its enormous industrial and human capacity at pilot training. Tens of thousands of young men flowed through programs across the country. They emerged as competent, aggressive fighter pilots in less time than it took Japan to train a single elite aviator. They were not, individually, the equal of Japan's veterans, but there were so many of them. And now, beginning in the summer of 1943, they had the Hellcat. Among the men who helped define American air combat doctrine was Lieutenant Commander John Thatch. He was a naval aviator who had already proven his tactical genius at the Battle of Midway. There, he had developed a defensive maneuver that pilots called the Thatch Weave. Pairs of fighters flew in a coordinated pattern, each covering the other's tail in overlapping arcs. It allowed outmatched American Wildcats to survive against Zeros long enough to make their kills. Now with the Hellcat, Thatch's philosophy of teamwork and mutual support combined with a machine that could actually exploit it to the fullest. American pilots trained obsessively in section tactics. 2 plane elements watching each other's tails. 4 plane divisions working together in coordinated attacks. There was no heroic lone wolf maneuvering, the kind that got men killed. Everything was disciplined, methodical, and practiced until it became instinct. The results began to stack up. Kill ratios that had been near parity in 1942 began to tilt, then tilt further, then tilt to a degree that became almost incomprehensible. The F6F entered combat on August 31, 1943, when Hellcats from the aircraft carrier Yorktown attacked Marcus Island. But the true test came that September in a series of engagements over Wake Island, and then in the grinding campaign through the Central Pacific. The early results were electrifying. Yes, the Zero could still outturn the Hellcat in a slow-speed dogfight. American pilots quickly discovered that accepting that challenge was still a poor idea. But the Hellcat did not need to turn with the Zero. It was faster in a straight line. It could dive away at speeds that sent the Zero shaking and out of control. It could absorb tremendous punishment and keep fighting. American carrier task forces began moving through the Central Pacific with a new kind of confidence, strike after strike, island after island. By early 1944, American carrier task forces built around Essex-class carriers loaded with Hellcats were operating almost freely across the Central Pacific. They struck Truk, Japan's great Pacific naval base, and left it a ruin. They struck the Marianas. They seemed to move where they wished, and Japan's diminished air power could not stop them. Japan's military planners understood that something had to be done. They conceived of a decisive battle. A plan called Operation Go that would gather what remained of Japan's carrier aviation and deliver a crushing blow against the American fleet. The plan had a certain logic to it. Japan's land-based aircraft in the Marianas would weaken the American carriers first. Then Japan's carrier aircraft would strike from outside the range of American attacks, using their longer range to hit American ships while remaining safely out of reach themselves. The Japanese commanders called it the decisive battle. They believed it could still turn the tide of the war. What the plan did not account for was the Hellcat, or the radar-guided interception systems behind it, or the sheer numbers that the American industrial machine had placed at the Navy's disposal. Japan was preparing to fight the war it had won in 1941. But it was now 1944. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. American radar detected the incoming Japanese formations at long range, long enough to scramble Hellcats in enormous numbers. Task Force 58, under Admiral Mark Mitcher, had 475 fighters available that day. Hellcats rose in waves. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a massacre. The Japanese formations flew older Zeros, newer but troubled variants, and other aircraft rushed into service to fill depleted ranks. They ran headlong into wall after wall of Hellcats. American pilots, directed by radar-equipped ships below, were guided precisely onto the incoming strikes before the Japanese aircraft could even reach their targets. The first Japanese wave lost more than 40 of its aircraft within minutes of encountering the American combat air patrol. The second wave fared no better. Then the third, then the fourth. Radio chatter among American pilots took on a quality that one commander later recalled as almost casual. Men called their kills matter-of-factly, moved to the next target, and called that one too. Commander David McCampbell, who would finish the war as the top-scoring American naval ace, personally shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single day's fighting. By evening, Japan had lost somewhere between 315 and 346 aircraft. American losses in air combat numbered 29. Sailors watching from the decks of American ships, seeing formation after formation of Japanese aircraft falling in flames, began to joke among themselves. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The phrase turkey shoot was irreverent, and it has stuck in history. But it obscures something important about what was actually happening in those skies over the Philippine Sea. The men dying in those Japanese aircraft were not incompetent. Many were skilled. Many were brave. They were flying into an ambush they had not anticipated, against a machine that negated their advantages, guided by a radar-directed system they had no counter to, in the hands of an enemy whose industrial capacity had simply overwhelmed them. The turkey shoot was not a victory of American pilots over Japanese pilots in any simple sense. It was a victory of American systems over Japanese systems, American industry, American intelligence, American doctrine, and American engineering. And at the center of it all was a blunt, heavy, unglamorous machine from Bethpage, New York. After the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic force was finished. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Japan lost not only hundreds of aircraft in the Marianas, but the trained pilots who flew them. Men whose accumulated experience and skill could never be replaced on the timetable Japan now faced. The carriers survived. Ships are easier to build than pilots, But what use is a carrier with no one to fly from it? At the Battle of Leyte Gulf that October, Japan's carriers were used as decoys, bait to lure American attention away from a surface attack. Japan's naval leadership knew there were no longer enough trained pilots to use them as anything else. The Hellcat's dominance continued through the remainder of the Pacific War. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, F6F Hellcats had accounted for 5,163 aerial victories. That represented roughly 56% of all enemy aircraft destroyed by Navy and Marine pilots. The kill ratio against all opponents stood at approximately 19-1. The numbers are so lopsided they seem almost fictional. They are not. With Japanese air power broken, American task forces could operate near Japan's home islands with a freedom that would have seemed impossible in 1942. The strategic bombing campaign carried out by B-29s from the Marianas depended on the Hellcat having secured those islands in the first place. The Hellcat did not just win air battles, it made possible the entire final chapter of the Pacific War. There is a lesson in the Hellcat story that goes beyond military history. Japan built the Zero for a specific kind of war, a war fought by elite warriors in aircraft of extraordinary refinement, where skill and elegance and individual mastery would carry the day. And for a while, they were right. But the United States built the Hellcat for a different kind of war entirely. A war of systems, of industry, of standardized training and radar-guided intercepts and 650 caliber guns that did not ask whether the man behind them was a virtuoso. A war where the supply of pilots, planes, fuel, and ammunition never ran out. The Zero was a masterpiece. The Hellcat was a weapon. And in the Pacific, weapons won. The young Americans who climbed into those cockpits, many of them farm boys and factory workers and college students who had been civilians just 12 months before, never received the recognition their counterparts in the European theater received. The Mustang, the Spitfire, the Thunderbolt, those are the names that echo in popular memory. The Hellcat is quieter in memory, but its record is undeniable. More aerial victories than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific. A kill ratio that stands as one of the highest in the history of air combat. And behind that ratio, the broken remnants of what had once been the finest carrier aviation force on Earth. The Japanese pilots who laughed at the F6F Hellcat were not fools. They were basing their judgment on everything they knew. On the war they had been fighting, on the aircraft they had mastered. What they did not yet know was that the war had changed. And by the time they understood that, the Hellcat was already above them.